He was never crowned, never chosen by bloodline, never handed a title by anyone above him. And yet, for over 20 years, the most powerful army in North America, with thousands of soldiers, telegraph lines, railroads, and 2 governments working against him, could not capture one man and a handful of followers hiding in the canyons and mountains of the Southwest desert. Newspapers called him a savage. Soldiers called him a ghost. His own people called him something closer to unbreakable. This is the true story of Geronimo. Before we go further, subscribe to this channel for more accurate, deeply researched history. Now, let's get into it. Long before the world knew the name Geronimo, he was known as Goyakla, the one who yawns. Born around 1829 along the Gila River in what is now the Arizona-New Mexico borderland, he belonged to the Bedonkohe band of the Chiricahua Apache, a people who had spent generations resisting outside control, first from Spain, then from Mexico, and eventually from the United States. Apache society did not work the way most people imagine when they picture a tribe. There was no king, no single ruler passing down a crown from father to son. Leadership was earned in the field, through action, not inherited at birth simply because of who your father was. Hold on to that detail. It changes almost everything you think you know about the man at the center of this story. Goyakla grew up mastering the skills every Apache boy needed to survive in one of the harshest landscapes in North America, tracking game across open desert, enduring extreme heat and cold, moving without sound, and fighting when fighting became necessary. At 17, he was formally accepted into the Council of Warriors, a milestone that carried real weight. It meant he was trusted to fight for his people. It also meant he could finally marry. He chose a woman named Alope. They built a family together. For a while, life moved at an ordinary rhythm. Trade with neighboring settlements, seasonal hunts, the quiet, repetitive work of survival in unforgiving land. Then, in a single afternoon, everything he had built was taken from him. In 1858, Goyakla traveled with his band to trade peacefully in the Mexican town of Casquilla. It was routine, the kind of trip his people had made countless times without incident. While the men conducted business in town, the women, children, and a small guard stayed behind at their camp outside the settlement. Mexican soldiers attacked the camp while most of the warriors were still away. When Goyakla returned that evening, he found his mother, his wife, and his 3 young children among the dead. Decades later, dictating his own life story to a translator, he would describe that moment in 4 words: "I had lost all." This was not a minor turning point in a longer biography. It was the fracture line of his entire life. From that day forward, he committed himself to war, first against Mexico, in a campaign fueled almost entirely by grief and vengeance, a commitment that would go on to define the next 50 years of his existence. And this is where the popular myth and the historical record begin to part ways. Geronimo was never a hereditary chief. That title, among the Apache, passed through bloodlines, formally and permanently, regardless of ability. What Geronimo held instead was something his people respected just as deeply, arguably more. He was a war leader, a position earned entirely through demonstrated courage, sharp battlefield instinct, and the rare ability to make other men willing to follow him into near-certain danger, again and again. It was during his campaigns against Mexican forces that the name Geronimo first appeared. And even today, historians are not entirely certain how it began. One widely cited account describes a battle where Goyakla broke from the usual Apache tactic of fighting from cover. Instead, he charged directly at Mexican soldiers across open ground, cutting a sharp zigzag pattern to dodge gunfire, closing the distance with a knife, and pulling rifles from the men he killed along the way. Terrified soldiers are said to have shouted, "Geronimo," invoking Saint Jerome, as a warning to one another whenever he appeared on the field. Whether the name began as a cry of fear, a mispronunciation, or something else lost to history, it stuck. First to the man himself, eventually to an entire era of resistance across the Southwest. By the 1860s and into the 1870s, Goyakla, now known across the region as Geronimo, had become one of the most effective guerrilla leaders in North America. He commanded small, fast-moving bands that knew the desert better than anyone hunting them. They could travel on foot for astonishing distances across terrain that broke horses and defeated wagons, live off land that looked empty to outsiders, and vanish into canyon country almost as quickly as they struck, leaving pursuing soldiers exhausted, dehydrated, and empty-handed. To the U.S. Army, it felt less like fighting a war and more like chasing smoke. In 1874, the United States government forced roughly 4,000 Apache people onto the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona, a stretch of land many who lived there described as barren, disease-ridden, and unlivable. Rations were unreliable. Movement outside the boundary was restricted and closely watched. For a people whose entire way of life depended on open, mobile territory stretching across hundreds of miles, San Carlos felt less like a home and more like a slow, grinding cage. Geronimo left the reservation multiple times over the following decade. Each departure triggered a new manhunt across the desert, pulling in soldiers, scouts, and resources from two countries. He was not alone in this resistance. Other Apache leaders waged their own parallel campaigns during these same years, but his name became the one most tightly linked to defiance itself, the one newspapers reached for whenever they wanted to describe the resistance as a whole. By the mid-1880s, the scale of the pursuit had become almost absurd when measured against the size of what it was chasing. At points over 5,000 American soldiers, roughly a quarter of the entire United States Army at that time, along with thousands of additional Mexican troops, were deployed across two nations to track down a band that by 1886 numbered fewer than 40 men, women, and children total. That imbalance alone tells you exactly what kind of adversary the U.S. military believed it was facing. The final pursuit stretched across the summer of 1886, through some of the most punishing terrain in North America. Negotiations broke down more than once. Promises were made and quietly altered. Geronimo, wary from decades of broken agreements, weighed every offer with the caution of a man who had watched too many surrenders end badly for his people. In September of 1886, after months of relentless pursuit through the Sierra Madre Mountains, Geronimo formally surrendered to General Nelson Miles in Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. It marked the end of the last major armed native resistance movement in the United States, closing a chapter of American history that had stretched across generations. What happened next is the part of his story most documentaries skip entirely, and it may be the most revealing chapter of his life. Despite surrendering under terms that promised his eventual return home, Geronimo was instead classified as a prisoner of war. He remained one for the rest of his life, 23 years, held first in Florida, then Alabama, and finally at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He was never once permitted to set foot again on the land he had spent decades fighting to protect. And yet, in captivity, Geronimo became something almost no one could have predicted: a public celebrity. He appeared at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, where he sold photographs of himself, along with bows, arrows, and buttons cut from his own coat, to curious visitors willing to pay for a piece of the legend. In 1905, he rode in President Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in Washington, D.C. A former enemy of the state, now paraded before the American public as a living symbol of a closed and settled frontier. Those who knew him during this period described someone deeply contradictory, shrewd enough to profit from his own legend, spiritually devout, respected among his people, as a practicing medicine man believed to carry visions of protection into battle. quick-tempered, and guarded around outsiders. And, according to nearly every account from those final decades, never truly at peace with the terms of his surrender. He asked, repeatedly and unsuccessfully, to be allowed to return home before he died. Near the end of his life, he sat with a translator and dictated his own account of everything he had lived through, determined that his story would not be left entirely in the hands of the newspapers and soldiers who had spent decades shaping his image without ever truly knowing him. That account remains one of the only first-hand records of the Apache Wars told from an Apache perspective, and historians still draw from it today. Geronimo died in February of 1909 at Fort Sill, still officially classified as a prisoner of war, having never been permitted to return to the Apache homeland he had defended for most of his life. His legacy resists a simple label, and that is exactly what makes it worth telling properly. He was not a hereditary leader, yet he became the single most recognized Apache name in world history. He was a devastating adversary in war, and later, an unlikely tourist attraction sought out by presidents and fairgoers alike. He fought first for personal vengeance and later for his people's survival and autonomy, and the line between those two motivations blurred more than most retellings admit. He was not a flawless hero, and he was not the caricature that 19th century newspapers built around his name to sell papers. He was a man shaped by devastating loss, who rose to lead through skill rather than birthright, and who spent the final third of his life as a captive celebrity of the very nation that once feared him more than almost any other man on the continent. More than a century later, his name is still recognized around the world, invoked by people who couldn't tell you a single accurate fact about who he actually was. Now you can. If this gave you a clearer, more accurate picture of who Geronimo really was, like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who only knows the myth, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one.